Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Sniper on the Eastern Front, Chapter 15, Hero of the Day. At the beginning of the war, awards meant something and were presented in a dignified setting, but now that the Lancers were in an endless fight for survival, awards were regarded by High Command simply as a way of strengthening morale. The resultant proliferation of awards robbed them of a large part of their meaning. Receiving another award just became part of everyday life. But a few days after the battles described above, the lieutenant from the regimental staff sent for Sepp again. "Herr Obergefreiter, you seem to be some kind of very special guy," he said as Sepp came in. "I am very proud to award you the Iron Cross First Class for your bravery during the tactical regrouping of the regiment and the evacuation of the first aid station. I must tell you in confidence that your deeds have attracted attention at the highest divisional level. There's something brewing, so be prepared for a surprise." This time Sepp was given a decorative printed document and the medal in its presentation case. Sepp immediately pinned across to his left breast pocket, ditched the case and posted the document to his parents. By his actions in the recent fighting, Sepp had not only proved his extraordinary personal bravery, but by his actions had also won a temporary strategic advantage over the enemy. Usually, he would have received no more than a German Cross in Gold for this deed, the highest bravery award given to other ranks in the Wehrmacht. But the commander of Army Group Center, General Schörner, promoted to Field Marshal on March 1st, 1945, was trying to raise the morale of his troops by the unorthodox awarding of medals. Consequently, Sepp had been recommended for the Knight's Cross because of his deeds. This was usually only awarded to officers and senior NCOs for personal bravery and extraordinary achievements of strategic importance. The Knight's Cross was one of the very highest decorations of the Wehrmacht and was usually awarded at a special ceremony and was accompanied by special leave to be taken immediately after the presentation. But with the collapse of Germany's military infrastructure, the value and significance of medals in the dying Reich had diminished, particularly since the criteria for receiving them had been absolutely undermined. Now, as the Lancers put it in their jocular but accurate way, it was a case of line up for the awards and bring your mess kit with you. So, the awarding of his Knight's Cross, which Sepp received at the same time as his comrade Josef Roth, was quite a simple affair. On April 20th, he and Roth were asked to come to Corps headquarters. They were picked up by an amphibious VW and driven to Mönnighofen, a small town near Mährisch-Ostrau. The headquarters was in some kind of farm that looked as busy as a beehive. Runners and vehicles came and went, orders were being shouted, and there were staff officers everywhere. They seemed to be busily preparing for departure. Sepp and Josef, with their worn-out fatigues and hardened faces, felt like pigs on a sofa among the neatly uniformed staff men. "It would do them good to lie with their asses in the shit," grumbled Roth. "I could show them the right places." They stood there like lost souls until at last a soldier brought a tin with herring and tomato sauce for each of them, then a piece of bread and a mess canteen with coffee substitute. So their long wait was well spent filling their stomachs, a rare opportunity for the Lancers these days. The hours passed and the two of them were sitting on the farmyard wall when there was suddenly a call from the building. "Where are the men for the Knight's Cross?" A sergeant came out and called to them with barely concealed sarcasm. "Are you the rifleman that shall be knighted? The colonel and his sword are ready for the solemn ritual." Slowly they got up. "A bit faster, guys, we have the big event ahead of us." Minutes later, they stood in a sort of entrance hall, and a colonel with the red stripes of the general staff on his trousers came towards them with a folder in his hand, followed by a soldier with a camera. Sepp and Josef involuntarily stood to attention with their carbines at their backs. "Stand easy, gentlemen," the colonel addressed them jovially. "Please excuse the makeshift nature of this solemn occasion, but I hope for your forgiveness bearing in mind the current circumstances. Actually, the Field Marshal wanted to congratulate you personally, but unfortunately there is no time. So may I thank you in his name." With that, he opened the folder and read. Army Group Center Headquarters, April 20th, 1945. To Obergefreiter Sepp Allerberger. It is an honor for me to award you the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross and a presentation hamper on behalf of the Führer on April 20th, 1945. I have learned from the reports of your commanders that you have demonstrated outstanding soldierly conduct and extraordinary bravery. I wish you much luck and a safe homecoming. Heil Hitler. General Field Marshal Schörner. Then the same text was read again, but with the name of Josef Roth in place of Sepp's. Then the colonel waved to a soldier who presented 2 knight's crosses, which were actually altered iron crosses second class, on a folded tent square. The officer took the first one, approached Sepp and asked, "Did you wash your neck today, Herr Obergefreiter?" When he saw Sepp's surprised face, he added, "Just kidding." Then he put on their crosses and carried on in a fatherly tone, "I'm really proud to have soldiers like you in our corps. My congratulations and my personal acknowledgement. I hope you survive the coming ordeal and return safe to your families and civilian lives." With that, he shook their hands, while the photographer's flashbulbs illuminated the scene eerily. You will get your proper Knight's Cross later, when the situation is consolidated, in a real ceremony with a document signed by the Führer himself. But for now, may I give you these letters from the Field Marshal. As a sign of his personal acknowledgement, they contain his signed photograph. Likewise, signed photographs of your divisional commander, General Klatt. Both of them recognized the bitter undertone in the colonel's words. It was clear to all of them that the war was lost and that complete collapse was just ahead. For obvious reasons, you will doubtlessly want to receive the gift box from the Führer right now. With these words, 2 soldiers each brought in an artillery ammunition box measuring about a meter in length, 15 centimeter high and 30 centimeter wide, full of luxuries. With the words, "All the best, gentlemen," the colonel turned around and disappeared through the next door. Meanwhile, the photographer had returned. "May I take another picture for the international press?" With that, he got them into position and the flashbulbs flared twice more. Before the photographer went away, Sepp asked him if he would send a copy directly to his parents at home. This he promised, and he actually did. With that, the ceremony was over. "Where may we put the presentation boxes for our heroes?" one of the soldiers teased him. At that moment, the jeep driver came in. "I'll be driving you back to your people, so put the boxes into my car." While the soldiers took the boxes out, Sepp asked the driver for directions to the mail room so that he could post a letter home. Under the circumstances, he wanted to send his Knight's Cross documents home as quickly as possible. He hoped that mail from Corps headquarters would have the best chance of reaching his parents. As a precaution, he used 2 envelopes. In one, he put his signed pictures and in the other, the documents. As it turned out, the photographs arrived safely, but the envelope containing the documents got lost. With their provisional Knight's Crosses around their necks, they drove back to their units, where their arrival was eagerly anticipated. Sepp had no trouble unloading his box from the jeep, as his comrades almost forced their help on him. Once they were in their dugout, the lid was removed and they were confronted by tins of meat and fish, schnapps, a bottle of cognac, cigars, cigarettes, chocolate, and cookies. In a spontaneous orgy, the entire contents were consumed, though Sepp naturally got a larger share of the cookies and meat. As hero of the day, he also kept a bottle of cognac and the cigars. The press was taken in by propaganda, and it picked up on occasions like this immediately. So Sepp's deeds were worth more than a headline in the local paper of his hometown, the Mittenwalder Nachrichten. The issue of April 25, 1945, bore the headline, "Our mountain riflemen as marksmen. Marksmen of a Gebirgsjäger regiment fighting defensive battles in the area of Teschen have achieved extraordinarily high shot results. The marksmen of the 2nd Company Gebirgsjäger from the Berchtesgadener Land shot 83 Bolshevists on April 1st. Obergefreiter Sepp Allerberger from Mittenwald, who belongs to another company, annihilated 21 Soviets on April 2nd and reached a total number of 100 hits. Obergefreiter Hetzenauer from Brixen, near Kitzbühel in Tyrol, reported his 200th hit on April 3rd. He is the division's most successful marksman. Chapter 16. The Momentum of Collapse. 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division stood with its back to the German frontier. The circle was about to close. The 1,000-year Reich, built on hubris alone, folded like a house of cards after just 12 years. Germany was bled white. It had brought war upon the world, and now its enemies were closing in from every side. The maxim of Hitler, "Germany will win or die," had led to increasing numbers of futile holdout orders and sacrifices since Stalingrad. The more disastrous the situation became, the more Hitler's supporters in the police, the SS and the Wehrmacht were given a free hand. By repression and the mobilization of the country's last human resources, they tried to stave off the inevitable downfall and destruction. But drumhead court-martials, Hitler Youth, old men and untrained scratch units could not delay the catastrophe. General Schörner, a convinced National Socialist, was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal and finally to Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht because of his unflinching determination to mobilize all available forces and subject them to severest discipline. In reality, there was nothing left with which to halt the increasing vortex of chaos. The momentum of the collapse had grown to such proportions that it could not be stopped. The Wehrmacht's logistical infrastructure and lines of communication and command collapsed like a burnt house. The populations of occupied territories rose up against the Germans in uncontrollable numbers, and acts of terror increased on both sides as the violent finale approached. Patrols of policemen, military policemen and Waffen-SS were formed in an attempt to restore military discipline and enforce order amid the general chaos. The result was indiscriminate brutality. After trials that lasted mere minutes, soldiers without their papers were sentenced to death and immediately hanged or shot, despite the fact that in the turmoil of the closing months of the war, no bureaucracy existed to provide substitute documents to men who had lost their papers in action. So, German soldiers often met an unjust and violent end at the hands of their own comrades. Civilians were killed with even less consideration, even though they had followed individual units as helpers and servants throughout the war. Groundless suspicions and subversion or collaboration with the partisans resulted in innumerable death sentences being handed out by drumhead court-martials. Although death had become Sepp's everyday companion, one incident of this kind deeply affected him. Almost at the same time as he had arrived in Russia in the late summer of 1943, a young Ukrainian woman had become a follower of the Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144. 22 years old, Olga was the mistress of an administration officer. In addition to warming his bed, she also performed useful tasks for the regimental staff, including acting as an interpreter. She was an uncomplicated, funny woman whose one ambition was to survive these disastrous times. In no way was she the sort to have anything to do with partisans. She was just happy to get away from the narrowness and regimentation of her village and hoped to find herself a better life somewhere in the West when the war was over. The officer to whom Olga was attached was envied for his pretty girlfriend, and Sepp had also looked at her longingly on a few occasions. Whether it was the result of a malicious report on some jealous soldier's part, or the arbitrariness of the Waffen-SS patrol that picked her up outside the regiment's position, he never found out. But Sepp witnessed her capture and her execution just 10 minutes later on the alleged charge of helping the partisans. An attempt by some of the riflemen to intercede on her behalf was in vain, and they were warned off with threats of violence. It filled Sepp with helpless rage when he saw that the administrative officer, her lover, did not make a move to save her despite her heartrending supplication. It almost seemed as if he was happy to get rid of her. It was known that he was married, and he was presumably fearful that his affair would become known beyond the troop if he made a fuss. So, Olga was driven under a tree in the back of a truck alongside some men in civilian clothes, then cables were tied around their necks and around a branch above them. Stunned, the pitiable girl stood there, silently weeping as she looked around for her lover, still hoping for intercession. But the fine Mr. Officer had already elegantly pissed off and could not be found. When all the cables were fixed, an SS man in the back of the truck slapped the roof of the driver's cab with the palm of his hand, and the lorry moved off. The cries of the condemned became choking and wheezing gasps as one by one they slipped off the back. Like worms on a fishhook, their bodies writhed in a desperate struggle for life. Depending on exactly how the cable strangled them, their tongues swelled from their mouths and their eyes seemed to burst. Olga's death throes lasted several minutes. While the SS men seemed to enjoy the spectacle, the rifleman turned away in disgust, muttering bitter recriminations. Sepp had to control himself not to lose his composure. Yet, a few days later, the incident had become just another episode, like so many others in this pointless war. The regiment had by now fallen back near Mährisch-Ostran, while the Soviet front had advanced to Brünn. In the meantime, the Russians had begun fighting their way through the streets of Berlin. It was no longer possible to talk about resistance being under coordinated and effective command. Depending on its organization, equipment, experience, and leadership, the Wehrmacht disintegrated into more or less effective pockets of resistance. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division was among those that held together and continued to resist. But the end was near. Immense numbers of refugees were pushing westwards, blocking the roads and paths. The riflemen fought on with whatever means remained at their disposal. It was one of the bitter ironies of these last few weeks of the war that weapons and equipment suddenly appeared at the front that the Lancers had only dreamt of before. A company of Waffen-SS marksmen was sent up to support one of the last attacks for which the riflemen mobilized their forces. Sepp could not believe his eyes when he saw their equipment. They were wearing special hooded camouflage smocks over their uniforms, had a camouflage cover for their helmets, and even had a veil that could be fitted around the helmet to conceal the face. Their webbing was made of green material. Attached to it was a bayonet that could be fitted to the K98 carbine and a very practical tool set. Every one of them had a self-loading Model 43 with a 4x telescopic sight. 2 were even equipped with the new fully automatic Sturmgewehr Model 44, fitted with the same telescopic sight as the semi-automatic weapons. But the troop consisted entirely of young guys of about 16 years who had been called up only a few weeks earlier. After a 2-week course, they had been formed into the combative elite of the Wehrmacht, which would now throw itself against the enemy in wild determination and self-belief of their invincibility. A lieutenant in his early 20s was in charge of the 40-strong troop. Sepp recognized the obvious carelessness of the officer, which left no doubt in his mind that the lives of his men meant very little to him. When they marched off and disappeared into the maelstrom, Sepp could only think, poor wretches. The division fought its way back to Olmütz. In the meantime, the rumor factory was operating at full power. Berlin is occupied, it was being said. The Führer is dead. Germany is about to surrender. Despite this, the division continued to resist bravely. Then, on May 8, 1945, the Russians suddenly withdrew to their own positions and ceased firing. Enemy aircraft dropped huge quantities of printed broadsheets reporting Germany's unconditional surrender and calling on the Wehrmacht to put down its weapons and surrender. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division's last commander, General Klatt, did not want to deliver his men up to the Russians, rightly fearing that they would be mistreated and meet with an uncertain fate. On the evening of May 9th, the final order from Wehrmacht High Command reached the division via radio. It said, "The staff of all units on the southeast and eastern fronts have been ordered to cease fire. The rebellion of the Czechs in Böhmen and Mähren may hinder compliance with the terms of capitulation and our communications in this area. The High Command has not received reports from combat groups Löhr, Redulik and Schörner. Arms were laid down at around midnight on all fronts. On the order of Admiral Dönitz, the Wehrmacht has ended the hopeless battle. The heroic struggle of almost 6 years is over. It brought us great victories, but also heavy defeats. In the end, the Wehrmacht was defeated by overwhelming numerical superiority. The German soldier has dutifully achieved extraordinary things for his people, and remained loyal to his oath. The homeland has supported him to the very end with all its strength. Even the enemy cannot deny respect for the achievements and sacrifices of Germany's fighting men on land, at sea, and in the air. Because of that, every soldier can put down his weapon with dignity and pride. In this hour, the Wehrmacht thinks of those comrades who fell. Our dead oblige us to continue in our unconditional loyalty, obedience, and discipline towards the fatherland that is bleeding from uncounted wounds." The officers read this order to the miserable remnants of their battalions and companies. They looked into emaciated and hardened faces and an uncertain and often horrible future. General Klatt decided to release all soldiers of the division from their oath and give them the chance to make their own way home. But this was easier said than done. As well as the uncounted holes in the German front line through which the Soviet units were pouring, there was also the problem of the Czech insurrection in their rear. Despite the roads being blocked with refugees, most of the riflemen opted to try to reach the American lines along the Moldau River using whatever vehicles they could lay hands on. But Sepp suspected that he wouldn't escape Russian captivity that way, and he decided to make his way to Austria with a comrade named Peter Golub, who had only been with the unit for a few weeks. They would have to get across 250 kilometers of enemy-held territory, but Sepp had plenty of experience of using the compass and of getting around unseen. To minimize the risk of capture, they had to do everything they could to avoid confrontation. This made long-distance weapons like Sepp's carbine with its telescopic sight superfluous. In addition, it was clear that hanging on to his marksman's rifle would have placed him in serious danger if he was caught. The fate of captured soldiers identified as marksmen was well known. Reluctantly, therefore, he realized that he would have to destroy his weapon and depend instead on a pistol, an MP40. He went to an assault gun that stood nearby with many lancers perched all over it, ready to try to break through to the west. "Wait a moment," he said to the driver, who was looking out of his hatch. "I want to put my carbine under your tracks so that it's really ruined." He pushed the butt under the left track, then stood up and waved to the driver. "All right, you can start." The motor roared into life and the tank lurched forwards. Its tracks grasped the stock of the carbine. Wood splintered and metal screeched on metal. With a dull bang, the lenses of the telescopic sight burst. Then the carbine completely disappeared beneath the tracks. Seconds later, a scattering of smashed pieces appeared behind the tank. Though his weapon had been just a tool, it was still a tough moment for him. With a handful of exceptions, all German marksmen destroyed their weapons either at the end of the war or before they were captured, and for this reason, original marksmen's rifles are extraordinarily rare today. Staring regretfully down at all that was left of his rifle, Sepp was suddenly awoken from his reverie by a loudspeaker-like voice in his ear. "Attention, attention! This is the voice of Pan-German Broadcasting!" Sepp turned around. Next to him once again stood the bushy-mustached Viking. "By means of his determined strategy, the Führer has achieved his aim of uniting his eastern forces with those fighting in the west to create a powerful military formation. After tough struggles, these troops have managed to lead their Bolshevist enemies to the capital. Here the Führer will give them the decisive shot in the knee, supported by Reichsidiot Himmler and propaganda snout Goebbels. Sieg Heil, we've had it." Even in their current bleak situation, the obviously indestructible Sergeant Major had clearly not lost his gallows humor wit. Patting Sepp's back and nodding towards the crushed rifle, he added, "Don't take it so hard, old guy. Now your chances of getting home intact are much better. And don't you follow the masses when you piss off. Well, enjoy the peace if you make it." And with that, he turned around and disappeared into the undergrowth like a ghost. Sepp and Peter prepared for their long march as well as they could, but despite their best efforts, they could not get hold of any food. However, the entire landscape to left and right of the road was strewn with the belongings of refugees, discarded or left behind, and from this, Sepp and his comrade gathered up odds and ends that they could carry easily and that they might be able to trade for food on their way. Various pots, a coffee mill, and 2 pairs of elegant ladies' shoes. They decided to take the shoes because of the everlasting vanity of women. Only a few German units surrendered as the Russians had demanded, most preferring to try to escape to the west. The Soviets therefore resumed their offensive on May the 10th, mounting massive tank and air attacks on the mixed convoys of refugees and military units that filled the roads. Even the smallest groups were shot at by fighter aircraft. Sepp and his comrade therefore decided to march at night and hide during the day. On the second night, while they were still in the German-settled Sudetenland area, they found a lonely farm. A waning light came from one curtained window. By now, they were very hungry and they hoped that they might finally get some food from the farmer. Carefully, they crept up and tapped on the window. The curtain was pulled aside and a 50-year-old man appeared with a candle in his hand. Seeing the 2 soldiers, he opened the window and asked them in broken German what they wanted. Sepp immediately recognized that he was a Czech and instinctively stepped back into the darkness, but such was his hunger that his inexperienced comrade forgot his caution and offered to swap a pair of shoes for some food. The Czech agreed to the exchange and took the shoes, saying, "Ruski soldier upstairs. Shh. Wait, I back in few minutes." With that, he disappeared. Though at the time he didn't know about the brutal expulsion of the Sudeten Germans by the Czech populations, Sepp suddenly became very suspicious, because through the window he could see on the wall a framed German text and below it a German calendar for 1944. What was a Czech doing in a German's house? Why was a Russian soldier peacefully sleeping upstairs? He nudged Peter and whispered, "Boy, this stinks. Forget the shoes and let's get the fuck out of here." With that, he pulled his comrade away from the window. But Peter said, "No, I don't believe it." And he extricated himself from Sepp's grasp. Sepp left him and ran back to the woods they had come from, hissing back at him, "Come on now, stupid, before they get you." His determination to flee unnerved Peter, who, after a last glance at the window, followed him. Sepp was 30 meters away and had already been swallowed up by the darkness, but his comrade had hardly gone 10 meters when the Czech reappeared at the window with an MP40 in his hands and opened fire. As soon as he saw the gun, Peter sprinted for the woods. Sepp spun around at the first sound of firing and leveled his own machine pistol as his comrade hurried towards him. Then Peter fell as if struck by lightning and Sepp opened fire. Glass shattered and the wooden window frame splintered, and though he didn't hit the Czech, he disappeared from the window and didn't fire again. Keeping low, Sepp ran to his comrade and dragged him to the safety of the edge of the wood, all the time expecting armed men to come out of the house. But everything remained deathly quiet. He let Peter down as soon as they reached the first bushes and turned him over onto his stomach. Peter moaned. Sepp felt the cloth of his uniform and found it was warm with blood. The Czech's volley had mortally wounded him. When he turned him onto his back again, he was already unconscious, and after a few minutes, he died. Sepp had kept the corner of his eye on the house all this time, but there was still no sign of movement. He fled as soon as Peter died, orientating himself by means of the pole star and his small pocket compass. Now that he was on his own, he had to be especially careful, since he had heard that the Czech partisans had taken to wearing German uniforms to lure their enemies out of hiding. Sepp therefore hid from small groups of men in German uniforms that marched past him, especially when he hid up during the day. As he was looking for a hiding place on the second day of his escape, he suddenly heard German voices nearby. Creeping in their direction, he saw a small group of men from his own division's artillery regiment. Carefully, he called to them and then rose from his hiding place. Before he could introduce himself, one of them recognized him. "It's Sepp Allerberger, the marksman with many kills to his name. He has the gold marksman's badge and the Knight's Cross." The group consisted of 12 soldiers led by the regimental cook, a staff sergeant named Viermeyer. Once Sepp's name was mentioned, a debate broke out among them whether or not they should take him with them. The skill of the Nazi propaganda machine now worked against him, because there had been lots of newspaper articles about Germany's marksmen that described their achievements in glowing terms, and photographs had been printed of many of them. Sepp in particular had often been the subject of these stories. It was quite likely that the Czechs and Russians knew his name and what he looked like and would be watching out for him. So the majority of the Lancers feared heavy punishment if they should be caught with such an infamous marksman in their group. Sepp felt very uneasy about this and wanted to go his own way, but the staff sergeant finally put his foot down and stopped the discussion, saying that Sepp could come with them. But he always had to walk at the end of the line to safeguard their backs, and he crept along behind them for 4 days, doing as little as possible to remind them of his presence. Feeling safe in such a large group, the Lancers continued to travel by day rather than under cover of darkness. On the 4th day, they found a dead Czech. The blood on his chest was not dry yet, so he had to have died only shortly before they got there. Curious but uneasy, they stood around him, speculating what could have happened. Then, suddenly, the body opened his eyes. His chest heaved, and with a loud wheeze, a glob of blood came out of his mouth. At the same moment, he sat up, grabbed the MP40 that was lying next to him, and pulled the trigger. The riflemen ran in all directions and threw themselves down in the grass. The bullets hissed high overhead without doing any harm, and mere seconds later the Czech fell down dead and the rest of his machine pistol's magazine emptied into the sky. Now the riflemen were all on the alert, because it was unlikely that the partisan had been on his own. At that moment, 3 more Lancers suddenly called to them from about 50 meters away. "Don't shoot, friends! We're riflemen from the 144th Regiment, 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division." Sepp recognized them as soldiers from the regimental staff. One was the regiment's photographer, another its official war artist, and the third was a clerk named Schmidt, who was called Schmidtle because of his smallness. The photographer was especially well known to Sepp, having documented many of his missions. The three of them had no fears of being with Sepp, in whose company they felt confident and safe, and Sepp was happy to escape the resentment of the artillerymen, so the four of them decided to part company with the latter. Since the photographer and Schmidtle both had compasses, Sepp swapped his with an artillerist named Tiermeyer in exchange for half a tin of meat. After the incident with the dying Czech, they were all anxious to get away as quickly as possible. So, after the photographer had taken a farewell group photograph, they wished each other well and parted. The artillerymen continued on their way in the sunshine, while Sepp sought out a safe place in which he and his three new companions could hide for the night. Not 15 minutes had passed before they heard wild gunfire from somewhere quite close by. Sepp decided to reconnoiter the situation and carefully crept through the undergrowth in the direction of the sounds. After he had gone about a kilometer, he saw the artillerymen involved in a violent firefight with some Czech partisans. 7 of the Lancers were lying on the ground, obviously dead. The whole situation looked hopeless. Sepp could see no chance of he and his 3 companions helping, since it would only have put their own lives at risk, so he returned to their hiding place. After describing what he had seen, they all decided to look for a new hiding place and crept away. For days they marched by night and hid during the day, always heading northwest. They avoided houses and villages and tried to avoid open roads and paths too. But they had one problem. The artist had been wounded in his right hand in an earlier skirmish with Czech partisans, and since it couldn't be properly treated, the injury had become inflamed. He developed a mild fever, and the wound turned septic after a few days and stank horribly. Whenever they found water, they tried to clean it and wash the bandage before putting it back on. They also had nothing left to eat, but they kept going by chewing birch leaves, sorrel and dandelion leaves and drinking their water mixed with saccharine pills, of which Schmidtle had a small supply. As dawn was breaking on the 15th day of their march, they looked for a hiding place on the banks of a clear stream. They were just tending their comrade's wound when they heard the sound of several vehicles. Sepp left the others and went to see what was causing it. After going about 500 meters, he came onto a road just in time to see 4 Mercedes trucks with SS registrations roll by. In their backs were unarmed Lancers. Instinctively, Sepp ducked back into the protecting thicket. He guessed he must be in a section of territory still held by fanatical SS soldiers who hadn't accepted the end of the war and were still rounding up fleeing Lancers and subjecting them to their own brand of uncompromising justice. At the onset of twilight, he and his companions left their hiding place and continued carefully on their way. By their calculations, they must be getting close to Reich territory by now. When they set out, Sepp had reckoned that they had perhaps 250 kilometers to go, and allowing for their weakened condition and an average nightly march of about 15 kilometers at best, he had calculated that it would take them about 20 nights to reach the frontier. An hour later, they came to a peaceful farmhouse. A woman was in the yard arranging her gardening tools. While the others hid in the grass, the photographer went over and talked to her. Seconds later, he excitedly waved to his comrades. "We've made it, boys! We're almost home. We're more than 20 kilometers inside Austria. The Yanks have been here, but the Iwans are far enough away to kiss our asses." Warm-heartedly, the woman welcomed them and asked them to come in, where she shared her food with them and cared for the photographer's hand. Besides potatoes and the first spring vegetables from her garden, she offered them fresh yogurt and apple juice. After months of privation, this tasted like nectar and ambrosia. Feeling safe, they ate until they were fit to burst. Like hundreds of thousands of mothers, this farmer had paid for the bloody ideological struggle on the Eastern Front with the lives of her 2 sons. When she got out the clothes of her children for Sepp and his companions to change into, tears ran silently down her cheeks. The Lancers took the clothes gratefully. Then they washed and went to sleep in real beds for the first time in more months than they could remember. After having had breakfast, again accompanied by yogurt and apple juice, the farmer showed them the way they needed to go to reach the next village, and they left, thanking her warmly as they went. She waved farewell after them, hardly managing to keep her composure. Probably she was wondering why her sons could not have been among the soldiers returning home. Rested and well-fed, the riflemen felt reinvigorated. In high spirits, they marched in the daylight now and along the open road. They buried their weapons at the edge of a field, hoping that, being unarmed, they would be treated fairly if they should be captured by the Americans. They exchanged jokes and talked about their desires as they began to look forward to a peaceful civilian life. Then suddenly Schmidle said, "Boys, wait a moment. Our homecoming is about to get a fanfare. My backside is going to explode if I don't fart." With that, his face assumed a look of concentration, but instead of breaking wind, there was a horrid squirting noise. His cheerful face suddenly froze to a mask of disgust, and a foul smell came from his trousers. Clearly, his digestive system hadn't taken kindly to its sudden reintroduction to such things as yogurt and apple juice. His 3 companions could hardly stand for laughing as Schmidle hopped about in his shitty pants. But his discomfiture at least taught them to resist the desire to fart themselves, which was a good job since again and again throughout that day they had to interrupt their march and retire into the bushes. Schmidle's organizational genius saved him from having to walk in his soiled underwear, for he had found several pairs of silk lace panties somewhere along the way to take home for his fiancée, and he decided to wear a pair of these while he washed his own in a stream and dried them. The photographer said, "Don't sit anywhere near me if you want to take a shit while you're wearing those. If I see your naked bum and that sexy underwear, I might forget myself." They all laughed. In the afternoon, they reached a small village the farmer had described to them. Talking as they walked down to the main road, they suddenly froze at signs of movement ahead. Not 50 meters in front of them, American soldiers were standing around a large number of captured Lancers. As they stood there for a moment, hesitating between flight and giving themselves up, one of the American GIs spotted them. Unslinging what seemed to be a self-loading sniper rifle, he aimed it in their direction and called, "Hands up, you guys, don't move. The war's over, Krauts. Your bastard Hitler's dead. Your scheiß Führer can't help you anymore. Come here, keep your hands up and move slowly." Although all they understood for a moment was something about hands up and Hitler and Scheißführer, Sepp knew better than to so much as twitch his lower lip. The GI could have shot them in seconds. Now it seemed the war had finally come to an end. Carefully, they raised their hands and walked towards the GIs. While they were being frisked for weapons, Sepp cast his professional eye over the American sniper rifle. It was of technically sound and robust construction, but he was surprised to see that its telescopic sight was mounted to the right. Another GI pushed them over to join the prisoners. "Sit down there and hope for better times," he said, smiling cynically. "I think you'll be getting a long holiday in Russia." The meaning of his words suddenly hit them. The war artist whispered, "Damn shit, they're going to hand us over to the Ivans. We gotta get away, or else we've had it." At this moment, a US Jeep and 2 Mercedes trucks with SS registrations and driven by SS soldiers came along the road and stopped in front of the prisoners. The nearest Lancers were forced to get into the loading space, and then they drove away again. "Have a nice trip, you glorious Aryan heroes," one of the GIs shouted after them. Now Sepp suddenly remembered the SS lorries he had seen 2 days earlier. They were conveying prisoners to the Russians. Sepp looked around. Their guards were not too attentive, since most of the prisoners were exhausted and had resigned themselves to captivity. Clearly, they didn't know about their extradition to Russia. Behind Sepp and his companions was a waist-high wall, and beyond that a bushy slope, a narrow valley bottom, and then a thick forest. Ideal cover for an escape. Carefully whispering to one another, they agreed that they had to get away before the next transport lorries arrived. While Sepp, the artist, and the photographer were uncompromisingly ready to take the risk, Schmidle at first hesitated, not believing that they would really be handed over to the Russians. But they agreed on the order in which they would attempt to slip away. The wounded artist first, then the photographer, then Schmidle, and finally Sepp. The adrenaline shot into their veins. Their hearts beat faster. Once more, they were about to risk their lives in order to survive. When 3 trucks came into sight, they used the opportunity of the distraction to make their break. The artist and photographer disappeared over the wall unseen, but when Sepp called on Schmidle to jump, he refused. "Shit, I'm going to wait. I'm not risking my ass anymore. The Yanks can't get away with delivering us up to the Ivans." All Sepp's efforts to persuade him failed. The lorries were getting nearer, and it was time to go if he was going to. Mere seconds were left. "Don't come them, housewife," he hissed at the clerk. "We'll wait for you for half an hour at the edge of the forest." Then Sepp jumped over the wall just as the lorry's brakes screeched. Minutes later he met up with his other 2 comrades in the woods, but the half-hour passed without Schmittler appearing. He would eventually return from the Russian lead mines of Karaganda 6 years later, a sick and broken man. Sepp and his companions marched on west. They still moved during the day, but now they took greater care because of the American patrols. On one occasion they took to an overgrown path to avoid a small village and got quite a turn when suddenly they were attacked by figures as thin as skeletons wearing striped suits. A violent brawl developed, but luckily their attackers were so weak that they were able to defend themselves from serious harm, standing back to back and punching at the starved bodies and faces. Even so, in the course of the melee, their enemies' many hands stripped them of most of what they were carrying. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the strange episode was over. Like wraiths, their attackers disappeared back into the bushes. The 3 comrades stood there out of breath and bewildered, seeking for an explanation for their strange assailants. They finally agreed that they must be the homeless inmates of a mental asylum. It was only some months later that Sepp realized they were the former inmates of a concentration camp who had escaped their guards and were plundering the neighborhood. When he eventually learned the full horror of the German camps, his feelings about the attack became a strange mixture of guilt and certainty in his right to defend himself. The next day they reached the town of Linz, which seemed to consist of nothing but refugees. Here they managed to find themselves a place in the back of an overfilled Opel Blitz truck, but after traveling a few kilometers from the town, their ride ended at an American roadblock. All the passengers were lined up along the edge of the road and searched, this time more carefully. Everything the Americans could use as souvenirs was kept. On the orders of an embittered NCO, every man had to expose his chest so that the GIs could look under the right arm for the tattoo worn by SS members. Then they had to sit at the roadside and wait. For the rest of the day, any men of military service age who came along were stopped and searched and ordered to join the others already waiting. In the evening, the entire group, now numbering more than 100, was loaded aboard lorries and driven back to the railway station at Linz, where they were boarded into cattle wagons and taken to a holding camp at Mauerkirchen the same night. Tens of thousands of former soldiers were forced to camp here in the open air. The Americans had meanwhile realized that it was obviously impossible to supply such a huge number, so just 2 days later they started to release those wounded men who were able to walk. Such was the confusion of the situation that Sepp and the photographer, who had pretended that they all came from the same village, were released with the wounded artist in order to look after him. From Mauerkirchen they were taken by truck to Garmisch-Partenkirchen and unloaded at the railway station. They were free. Their lives belonged to them again, even if they didn't quite realize it at the time. Their first priority was to get the artist to a hospital, but once that was done, they would set out for their own homes. They watched as an overcrowded train rolled out of the station with people sitting on the roof and standing on the running boards. Sepp stared. Sitting on top of the last wagon was the Viking. He was speechless as they recognized each other at exactly the same time. The Viking waved to him, then put his right hand to his cap, which surprisingly still boasted its Edelweiss badge, and gave him a final military salutation. Instinctively, Sepp did the same and watched until the train disappeared out of sight. Sepp would never see the Viking again, but he has never forgotten him. A few hours later, he stood outside his parents' house in the small village near Mittenwald. The houses were as tranquil as if they had slept through the entire war. It was June 5th, 1945. Sepp Allerberger had survived the inferno almost unhurt, physically at least. His heart would remain hard and scarred for the rest of his life. The specter of war would never let go of him. Epilogue. Beyond the mountains, the first light of a new day came up. Sepp came back from dark memories and found himself holding his right forefinger, which had brought death to so many enemies. He asked himself the same questions he had asked many times before. Was it right to do what he had done? Was there any alternative under the given circumstances? Was there any difference between his own fight for survival and those of the many enemies he had killed who had been put in the same situation and subjected to the same grim laws of war? They were questions to which an Obergefreiter would never find the answers. Ordinary Lancers never had a choice. For them, it was simply a matter of fight or die. Sepp became suddenly aware of the morning coolness and went back to bed to get some sleep. As he lay there, he thought of a poem he had found on the back of a report sheet, written by an anonymous comrade. The men under the sign of the hawk, they recognize each other by their faces. They shake each other's hands. They don't talk. When others talk and brag, they grow hard and silent. In their hearts turned to steel, the horror lives on. The horror of uncounted deaths when they screamed, their comrades in need, when they put their hands up begging, reddened by their shed blood. The horror in the roaring of grenades, in the crashing salvos, when the earth convulses and groans, burning like Judgment Day. They were lying in the throat of hell. They were soldiers doing their duty. And there we go, home at last, reunited with his family. Sepp has survived what was probably the most gruesome theater in the entire war. He saw friends die, he saw unspeakable acts of horror committed by one human being unto another. This experience left him a changed man for certain. But it made it possible for us to relive what it was like, and that alone is commendable. We also learned that the Viking apparently survived, a person that some of you asked about in the comments. Which wasn't a given. As we've seen, there was always a risk of running into partisans, lone SS units, or even some Americans that would ship you right back to the Russians. But there are a few other things to talk about here. Mainly his Knight's Cross. Now, this is a matter of contention. It begins with the claim that only officers and NCOs were awarded this medal. This is a slight error in the translation. In the original German version, it is stated correctly that this medal was technically only awarded to officers and senior NCOs because the requirements for this specific award were so immense that strictly speaking only feats of command would qualify. It was awarded for actions that were decisive for the outcomes of entire battles and as such were hard to achieve for the common soldier. Now, the law that covers the Iron Cross and the Knight's Cross also said that personal gallantry would qualify, but in this case you would have had to get the Iron Cross second class and the Iron Cross first class beforehand. However, during the final months of the war, the requirements were toned down, and from a certain point on there was a blanket permit for all applications of the Knight's Cross. It is also known that some commanders issued Knight's Crosses without consulting High Command first, and as such did it on their own initiative. Such awards are, strictly speaking, not valid by the letter of the law. I'm sure, however, that it felt very valid for Sepp. The thing is, there are only 2 images of him wearing the improvised Knight's Cross, which the book claims are the ones he sent home. I've put them on screen. One is quite obviously a forgery, the other bears a striking resemblance of the image in the intro. If you superimpose them, they match pretty much exactly, except for the award. You be your own judge in this matter. The fact is that he doesn't appear in the official Knight's Cross bearers registry. Yes, this exists, but due to the circumstances, I'm inclined to say that his divisional commander awarded the Knight's Cross on his own initiative. Make of that what you will. Finally, the ending and the poem. I can assure you in the German original the poem does rhyme, but I think its emotions are conveyed pretty well. It is a fitting end to this incredible book. The report will follow, and so, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching and the continued support. I appreciate it, and each and every one of you. Let me know what you thought about the book in the comments, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next episode. Cheers.